We're opening or beginning tipping off the last panel, and I know one or two of you were here earlier in the morning, but just to quickly restate our history, when we decided we were coming out of the gate on the first public hearing, it was real important that we listened to those organizations that have been in theater, reviewing those oversight organizations, reviewing the contracting practices, and reviewing, sort of walking part of the mandate that we have. And appreciate all three, and we thought it was important, and maybe we convinced ourselves that this is one of the few times the three inspectors general from DOD, state, and USAID get to sit on a panel together. And then I found out there'd been at least one other case where you all have sat on a panel previously, but nonetheless we thought that this was a special opportunity. So with that as an introduction, and with the statement that we very much appreciate your coming up here and very much appreciate the work of your excellent staff, I'd kind of like to start this off, and Mr. Gimbel, I will start with you, if I might, and the Department of Defense, sir.
Chairman Tebow and members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our ongoing oversight efforts regarding wartime contracting. As you know, DODIG has a primary responsibility within the Department of Defense for providing oversight of programs and funds appropriated to the Department both at home and around the world, to include Southwest Asia. In this role, the DODIG office oversees and coordinates oversight of DOD resources. We spearhead the DOD oversight community in auditing, investigating, and inspecting accountability processes and internal controls in areas such as acquisition, contracting, logistics, and financial management. We also work in close partnership with other oversight organizations such as the GAO, the Special Inspectors General for Iraq and Afghanistan, Inspectors General of the Department of Defense, and USAID, as well as the military departments and the Military Department Auditors General. Also, we work closely with the FBI and U.S. Army Criminal Investigative Command. The coordination for these efforts are primarily handled through the Southwest Asia Joint Planning Group and the International Contract Corruption Task Force. We've identified some specific issues to contracting in a war zone which have resulted in potential for fraud, waste, and abuse, such as the inexperienced and insufficient contracting personnel, the lack of adequate oversight, and crimes involving military members. Most of the examples reduced oversight resulting from the need to engage in contingency contracting. From the inception of the global war on terrorism, military and civilian contract administration personnel engaged in contingency contracting designed to obtain much-needed goods and services as quickly as possible. Contract administrators focus primarily on timely mission accomplishment versus ensuring the strict adherence to traditional contract administration procedures, many of which are designed to reduce the risk of corruption and abuse. When engaging in contingency contracting, administrators may not consider the risk of increased levels of fraud resulting from the lower levels of oversight, as the mission is to provide goods and services as promptly as possible. When left unchecked, this mindset can become pervasive to the extent administrators begin to view oversight responsibilities as unwelcome burdens, conflicting with their ability to effectively perform their duties. For example, in our audit of internal controls over payments made in Iraq, Kuwait, and Egypt, we found that adequate internal controls were not maintained to ensure payments were properly supported. Also, as was the case regarding weapons accountability during our review of the accountability of arms and ammunition provided to the security forces of Iraq, we found that during the increased tempo to supply security forces with arms, and that the controls over accountability of those weapons were not kept up to the normal standards. Effective oversight of diverse functions performed under high-value logistics and support contracts requires a sizable cadre of highly trained government contracting personnel with specialized knowledge and significant acquisition expertise. Additionally, the contract administrators must be assigned a reasonable workload, or their ability to engage in effective oversight and identify potential fraud, waste, and abuse will continue to suffer. The civilian military contract administrators and contract technical representatives should be career contracting professionals adequately trained in the trade. Work conducted throughout Southwest Asia has revealed many instances where the lack of contractor official oversight has resulted in an environment ripe for corruption. For example, in Iraq, fraudulently obtained CAC cards were used to steal 10 million gallons of fuel. It's valued at about $40 million. The Department depends on responsible agency officials with oversight responsibility to monitor contract performance, implement internal controls designed to deter waste and refer potential fraudulent activity that is uncovered through proactive internal reviews. However, it appears that the resources have been inadequate, especially early in the deployment, which would help identify the later abuses. Maintaining public support for defense programs requires good contract oversight and prompt identification of any problems. When running the Truman Commission, President Truman, then Senator Truman, stated, "I have had considerable experience in letting public contracts, and I have never yet found a contractor who, if not watched, would not leave the government holding the bag. We're not doing him a favor if we do not watch him." Well, Senator Truman's concerns on oversight remain viable today. As I've described in my prepared statement, increased attention to the following areas is essential to effective oversight of contracting in Iraq, Afghanistan, and future contingency operations. Those areas are property and cash accountability, the Commander's Emergency Response Program, contingency contracting support to include systems, people, and processes, and controls over contractor common access cards. In closing, we're committed to providing effective, meaningful oversight that assists DoD to address its challenges in conducting operations, safeguarding taxpayers' money from waste, fraud, and abuse, and most importantly, ensuring our brave military, civilian, coalition partners, contractors, and the Iraqi and Afghanistan citizens supporting a free and sovereign democratic state are as safe as possible. We recognize that this is a vast and important mission, and we're proud to be a part of this historic and important effort. Our office is on firm footing to provide the necessary oversight. We thank the Commission for the opportunity to discuss our ongoing efforts and observations, and we look forward to continuing our strong working relationship with all the other oversight organizations engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, the process we are going to use is we're going to go ahead and take the statements from State and then USAID. So thank you, Inspector General Kimball and Inspector General Geisel. Can you proceed, sir?
Mr. Co-Chairman and members of the Commission, I am honored to appear here today representing the Office of Inspector General of the Department of State and the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Mr. Chairman, I have some remarks based on your questions and would ask that our written testimony be included in the record. In our current work, OIG has found the same problems with contracting as we did 14 years ago when I served my first term as Acting Inspector General. A major difference, of course, is that the Department of State is using many more contractors much more frequently in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our recent reviews of worldwide personal protective services, the Kennedy Report, and our inspection of the Office of Acquisitions, among others, all carried a consistent theme that demands our attention and the Commission's consideration. In our reviews, OIG found that there is a serious lack of resources to provide adequate day-to-day contract management and contractor oversight. My written testimony provides considerable detail of a number of OIG reviews related to contracting in wartime. In these remarks, I want to focus on two reviews by our Middle East Regional Office: the Department's compliance with the Secretary of State's panel on personal protective services in Iraq, or as it is known, the Kennedy Report. I will then outline our report on diplomatic security management of the Worldwide Personal Protective Services, or WPPS, contract. In the Kennedy Report review, we found that despite improvements made, the Department still faces numerous challenges, including insufficient numbers of special agents, unresolved status of the private security contractors in light of the new status of forces agreement in Iraq, An Iraqi public opposed to the use of these contractors, the government of Iraq's announcement that Blackwater Worldwide will not receive a license to continue operating in Iraq, and curtailment and increased costs for private security contractors should immunity from Iraqi prosecution be lifted. In our report on DS management, we found that DS was highly effective in ensuring the safety of mission personnel in Iraq. However, DS did not have a strong control environment to ensure the WPPS contract was effectively managed, assets were safeguarded, and laws and regulations were followed. These deficiencies resulted from frequent changes in management personnel and staff turnover, rapid expansion of activities, understaffing and an overwhelming increase in workload, lack of operating policies and procedures, and staff frustrated by an inability to satisfy all information requests. I would point to a particular issue we believe underlies the conditions found in the two Iraq reviews. In 2006, we reviewed the Office of Acquisitions. We found that contract spending department-wide had grown dramatically in recent years, from $1.87 billion in FY 2000 to $5.85 billion in FY 2005, an increase of 213%. During the same 5-year period, the department's staff increased by only 16%. As a result, the procurement function in the department was approaching a crisis situation. We recommend the Commission consider the following. First, ensure sufficient funding for both contract management and contract oversight when certain wartime conditions exist. Second, establish government-wide standards to help managers determine inherently governmental and non-governmental functions. These standards should be used to determine the size of the U.S. government workforce and the need for contractors. While these recommendations can provide a good beginning, we should note that reconstruction funding made up only 10 to 15% of the overall U.S. investment in Iraq since 2002. All of us at this table have significant oversight work in Iraq. In 2008, SIGIR had $34 million to oversee their portion of the U.S. investment in Iraq. That same year, State OIG's budget of less than $34 million covered oversight of all department and BBG programs worldwide, including Iraq and Afghanistan. Clearly, the investment and oversight can fall out of balance if agency IGs are not adequately resourced to meet the long-term challenges of conflict and post-conflict scenarios. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you, Inspector General Geisel. Inspector General Batista, sir, please proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Thibault, Commissioners, good afternoon. I am pleased to appear before the Commission today to testify on behalf of the Office of Inspector General for the U.S. Agency for International Development to share some of our findings and observations as a result of our oversight of development work in Iraq and Afghanistan. Reconstruction and development efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq have been difficult, as you know, and as has our oversight of these efforts. USAID employees, as well as our auditors and investigators, have been operating in what is often an unstable environment where security is always of paramount concern. Lack of security affects virtually every aspect of USAID's programs. In addition to causing increases in operating and program costs, the dangerous environment imposes significant constraints on USAID's ability to monitor programs. Officials are unable to make routine site visits, and their host country counterparts are often reluctant to be seen meeting with Americans. USAID's implementing partners have been the targets of threats, kidnappings, and murders by insurgents. Security concerns likewise limit our ability to conduct routine audit and investigative work. Trips must be cleared through the embassy in advance and can be canceled without notice, and armored vehicles and armed guards must accompany us on all assignments. The U.S. government relies on private security contractors for a wide variety of security services, including the protection of individuals and facilities, and are vital to U.S. efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nevertheless, the use of armed contractors to perform security tasks, coupled with prior incidents involving some of these contractors, has raised concerns about the level of accountability and oversights of these firms. Recently, as a result of our ongoing investigative work in Afghanistan, a private security firm and 4 of its employees were charged with conspiracy and fraud for submitting inflated expenses for vehicles, fuel, and other items. USAID has suspended the security firm and its principals. In our 2005 audit of Kroll Government Services International, a security firm with whom USAID contracted, we raised concerns about USAID's contracting processes and poor oversight in the purchase of armored vehicles. As a result of our work, USAID re-educated its contracting officers on numerous acquisition regulations and revised its policy on armored vehicle purchases. We have been providing audit and investigative oversight in Afghanistan since the start of USAID's programs in 2002. In Iraq, our oversight started almost immediately after the war began. We have been able to conduct substantive oversight with a relatively small investment from U.S. taxpayers. Since 2003, we've expended approximately $18 million to oversee the more than $14 billion obligated by USAID for Afghanistan and Iraq development programs. We pursue a vigorous program of performance audits as well as an extensive program of financial audits of major contractors and grantees. To date in Afghanistan and Iraq, we have conducted 70 performance audits, issued 149 financial audits, and initiated more than 80 investigations. This work has resulted in 178 recommendations for program improvements, caused over $26 million in questioned costs to be sustained, and saved or recovered an additional $26 million. Our investigations have resulted in 10 arrests, 8 indictments, 3 convictions, and 17 instances of administrative actions. Because we were active in Afghanistan before the start of the Iraq War, we learned some lessons there that we then applied to Iraq. One such lesson is that audit oversight in high-risk situations needs to be planned at the outset of program implementation and carried out at the appropriate time. This is particularly true for financial audits. Conducting financial audits as program money is expended prevents minor issues from becoming major concerns, especially when significant funding is at stake. And it sets the tone for accountability that carries through the life of the project. Our oversight work has paralleled the evolution of USAID's programs in Afghanistan and Iraq, from relief and stabilization to reconstruction to sustainable development and capacity building. Of the 16 audits we planned to conduct in Afghanistan and Iraq in fiscal year 2009, 8 involved capacity building programs. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, we have seen problems with oversight of contract and program management, as well as with data quality and results documentation. We found oversight problems as well as suspected fraud in USAID's Iraq's $544 million community stabilization program. We could not determine whether the program was achieving its intended results, which were to generate jobs and reduce incentives for Iraqis to participate in the insurgency, because of the unreliability of reported data. Further, the audit found that potential fraud had not been reported timely. We recommended the suspension of program activities in a specific region of Baghdad. We also recommended that USAID redirect $8.5 million to other programs and review activities in other regions in Iraq for similar evidence of fraud. USAID has addressed all of our audit recommendations, and investigations of fraud in the Community Stabilization Program are ongoing. In a recent investigation of a USAID program implemented by the United Nations Development Program in Afghanistan, we uncovered many performance and financial control problems and potential violations of law. Although the organization will not be prosecuted because of immunity issues, USAID has issued bills of collection to the organization totaling $7.5 million, has initiated systemic changes to increase program oversight, and has declined requests for additional funding. In Afghanistan and Iraq, 153 of our 178 recommendations have been implemented, and 36 of the 178, or 20%, were closed by the time we issued our audit reports. There are no open audit recommendations more than 1 year old, and USAID is in the process of resolving those that remain open. The open recommendations generally involve working with host government organizations to promote sustainability of programs, collecting question costs, ensuring that construction projects comply with regulations, and improving data quality. In Afghanistan, we conducted a review of work on the Kabul to Kandahar highway in 2003. We found that the contractor lacked an updated implementation plan to facilitate the timely completion of activities. When we conducted a second review in March of 2004, the implementation plan was in place. The construction activities were then on track to meet established deadlines. These periodic reviews are important to ensure that our recommendations are being implemented as intended and that programs are achieving their goals. In September of 2003 audit involving contract oversight, we found that USAID had not provided their contracting officer, technical representatives, or COTARs, enough training to acquire core competencies or to understand and perform the full range of tasks assigned to them. In addition, USAID lacked a process to formally hold their COTARs accountable for the performance of their tasks assigned to them. It did not ensure that designation letters were obtained for all contracts. We made 5 recommendations to help address these programs. However, in 2008, a follow-up audit found that these recommendations had not been addressed properly. I immediately brought those to the attention to the administrator, who recognized the problem and directed changes in the training and documentation for COTARs. Overall, our work has resulted in improvements in development operations and in program implementation. USAID has improved contracting procedures, strengthened contractor oversight, and ensured completion of monitoring plans and performance reports. We have identified defective work, and USAID has taken corrective action in such areas as highway completion and building construction. Moreover, we have identified instances in which funds can be put to better use. We support USAID's efforts to increase oversight and accountability of its development resources in a very difficult environment. Some of the changes the agency has made include hiring additional local staff who can operate more easily in Iraq and Afghanistan than U.S. employees, coordinating with military personnel in some cases when they may provide assistance in areas of poor security, and employing virtual techniques such as periodic digital photography to document progress in infrastructure reconstruction. However, more work is needed. Security program problems in both Afghanistan and Iraq will continue to affect development efforts, and we understand that the risks constrain USAID's ability to manage activities. However, both my office and USAID recognize the importance of carrying out U.S. assistance accountably. Aside from coping with security issues, USAID must have a substantial and well-trained core of contract and activity managers to oversee programs. The agency must continue to find ways in these difficult and dangerous environments to improve the quality of its performance data. With sound data, USAID can measure its efforts successfully and demonstrate to the American people that tax dollars are being spent wisely and making a difference in countries that are vital to our interests. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about some of the challenges we have seen in implementing development programs in Afghanistan and Iraq. We are committed to working through the challenges along with USAID to provide effective oversight and help improve development programs. I'd be happy to answer any questions the committee might have. Mr. Chairman, I have also submitted a written statement that I asked to be made part of the record of today's hearing.
Thank you, Inspector General Gambbattista. All of your statements that you've submitted will be submitted for the record as submitted and written. What we're going to do now is go around and provide questions as various commissioners would like. I'd like to start, Inspector General Gimbel, with you, and I'd like to talk about this subject of contractor identification, or what's referred to as CAC cards. And I know that you've had a couple of reviews, and you've got a review ongoing. Some of your reviews in the past, and your testimony, the written statement you submitted, has outlined that there have been major control issues in identifying the contractor population, and this has come through several other oversight reviews. And more importantly, though, assuring that contractor employees have proper identification with approved access to military facilities, everything from where they're going to sleep to what they're going to eat to properly, authorized to do that. You've outlined in your statement that contractor identification CAC cards have been used in very high dollar thefts and other wrongdoing activities. Most importantly, you've brought in the security word, that, security issues and security concerns, if the Army's losing visibility over access and control over government facilities by the contractor population. As numerous organizations briefed us, have come to appreciate the potential for force protection issues, and I believe that's what this could come down to, and bear with me. We just can't afford any occurrence where even one individual uses an improperly obtained ID card to wound or kill American military or other employees. And we can't afford substantial numbers running around using identification cards that, or CAC cards as they're referred to, improperly or don't have authorization. And in your testimony, for example, you outlined that there are over 25,000 badged contractor employees that haven't been properly vetted. Now, I realize that if they've been properly vetted, maybe the large majority of those would have been granted badges or identification. However, as I said before, it only takes one to create, to use the most basic word, a tragedy or that could occur. And so vetting them, I mean, there's a reason they have the policy and procedures, and there's over 25,000. There's over 35,000 employees outlined in your testimony of employees running around with unexpired ID cards, current ID cards, where the contract's been completed. Now, the inference, if someone says, well, that's not really a problem, might be, well, they're working on another contract. However, I have to share with you, and that's a big part of my leading into asking the question, that when both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, whenever I went to the cafeteria, I kind of left my traveling mates and sat down with the young soldiers because, I find that very insightful. And I'd ask them how they're doing. They'd ask me what I'm doing, and I'd tell them, a little bit about, without trying to get a fog count too bad, that we're looking at contracting and contractors. And the story came up with one that very clearly that there was a resentment, because they were aware in some of their discussions that there were contractor employees that were hanging around waiting to get another job. They didn't say, well, here, go find so-and-so, but they were very explicit, and there were 3 or 4 of them, and that because they had current CAC cards, they were able to find a place to sleep, food, laundry, and things like that. If they wanted to work out, they could work out because they had a current ID card that said you can use all these facilities. And they were kind of bragging about the fact they were shopping jobs and were going to go out and catch on with another contractor. And I kept asking around about that, and apparently that happens more often than a person might like. So it not only raises a question about a force protection issue, but it raises a question about increasing the cost on these contracts by people that should have been sent home. And, I'm very appreciative of the work you're doing. I know you've been on the record and you're doing a follow-up. I'd anticipate the follow-up may be just even more forceful. But I kind of appreciate 2 things. One, the best update you can give us in terms of the status of that review and whether you're finding the same types of issues. But more importantly, I'm interested in what might be some of your recommendations that the Army should do about it, or what they should be doing to deal with the contractor that's having the difficulty keeping track of all this. And one of the things that I know in some of my days that the military would do, Department of Defense would do, and they have a very significant problem, and I'd propose to you force protection's a very significant problem, they would have what we used to call stand-down days. They'd do it for quality. They'd do it when there was a certain deficiency and everybody needed trained so they could do it, and they'd stop for 4 hours, stop for a day sometimes. And one of my questions is, what's the Army going to do about this? What have they told you they're going to, other than we'll look at it, which isn't acceptable to me, and I doubt if it's acceptable to you, but I'm going to listen. And have they considered something like canceling all these 200,000 ID badges at a point in time and reissuing them so we know they're properly vetted, they're working on active contracts, they should be here, and the like. And I know, Inspector General Gimbel, I circled it a lot, but it's sort of an area that I'm sensitive about, and you're the man that's looking at it, and you're the man that's doing or your organization doing the follow-on, and I would just appreciate being updated and letting me know what the Army's going to do about it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. It is, in our view, a very significant problem because, as you say, the CAC cards allows free access into military installations. It allows access into the computer system. And it also allows access, as you point out, the ease to go into the dining facilities and so forth. As we reported, we've got a number of issues of the control and how these cards are issued. We think there's some basic control issues that have to be addressed in terms of proactive control. How do you know one is the person, as you said, has not been vetted? We need to have the people vetted, but more importantly, we need to have a control as when those contracts are over as to how do we collect those cards and not allow that shopping around or continuation of a card. We think on the security issue, we briefed the DNI, we briefed the Deputy Secretary and PNR, and also NII on the network issues of this. And I think everyone is concerned. I think you're going to see some good proactive operations to do this, to correct this problem. Now, what I haven't seen is that, as you might suggest, is that if there's X number out there that they cancel and reissue them, I think that might certainly be one thing to be considered in the future, but I don't think we've gotten to that point yet because once we get this cleaned up, we want to make sure that we have proactive measures in place to control it for the future.
All right. Well, thank you, and I absolutely support the work you're doing. And you can say that this is dead square center on one of the focus concerns of contracting, the cost of contracting, the controls, and the force protection issue. And thank you. And I think my next question is going to run over the couple of minutes I have left, and in sort of respect of time, maybe I'll tag those 2 minutes onto my next round of questions. And Commissioner Ervin, if you could tee it up, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question likewise to start anyway to General Gimbel. General, you referenced this issue in your remarks, the issue of the mindset whereby the warfighting mission takes precedence in the mind of not just the warfighters, the military commanders and the troops who work for them, but also contract officers, military contract officers. The mindset that getting the warfighting mission accomplished necessarily has to take precedence over adhering to strict contract procedures. My question to you is, how do we overcome that mindset in terms of training, in terms of evaluation, promotion, compensation, if necessary, prosecution, etc.? And what's being done in that regard now?
Sir, I think one of the things that might be considered is the civilian reserve corps. What we need to have is an ability to, when we deploy, to have a fully trained workforce. Now, having said that, there is the issue of you do have to get the mission done, but the question becomes is how long do you stay in that mode until you bring it back in and put the contracting under the proper controls. We'd like to see that done from the outset. Obviously, as if you go back into the invasion, and I'll use examples of weapons accountability, it was known to be a problem. The people never denied that they took those weapons out there and they distributed them to the Iraqi security forces, didn't maintain proper accountability. And so now later on we determined that is a huge problem. And so, now it's a process of catching up and putting the business operations. There's a warfighting side of this and there's a business operations side. And we need to be very careful not to ignore the business operations side. So I think the answer to your question is that we need to have some kind of reserve force for contingency operations. And I would submit, too, that we ought not to overlook issues like Katrina. And that's a contingency contracting operation also.
Mm-hmm. A question for General Geisel. The Blackwater contract has been, as you referenced, terminated. Well, what steps are being taken to ensure that the abuses we saw there don't happen likewise with regard to Triple Canopy and DynCorp?
That was discussed in our Kennedy report, and essentially the first order of business as you know, was that the department put diplomatic security agents on the contract, on the movements of personnel to the greatest extent they could. I would estimate that at this stage of the game, they're on virtually every movement. And in addition to putting the diplomatic security officers on the movement, there are cameras, just like you see in some of the police cars here, that record the details of every movement, and those movements are monitored back in the regional security office at the embassy itself. But, you know, it's not only that solved the immediate issue of the abuse, but what concerns us is that while this particular worry seems to have been resolved, we still face the constant pressure in the field that DS security agents are overwhelmed with their protection responsibilities, and they are unable to monitor the execution of contracts the way that we would like. And it's very important that the more mundane or seemingly mundane issues are also addressed. And we're talking about that the right people are being billed for, and that they actually work the hours that the contractors say that they work, that the contracting officer representatives are verifying that the weapons are properly accounted for. But still in all, I think the issue of contractors going wild is not an issue in Iraq at this time.
Thank you for that. You anticipated my follow-up question, and that is, should contractors be involved, ideally, in providing security to our diplomats? Should this function be performed by our military, in your judgment?
I would say that it can be either. We're looking at quality, and we're looking at availability. This wasn't an issue in prior wars because there were adequate numbers of military. We certainly have seen examples where contractors have done an outstanding job. But the key issue is, just as if we had uniformed military, we have a chain of command, and everybody knows what they do, and everybody knows that they're going to be held accountable, and indeed that they'll be court-martialed. The issue, if we use contractors, is how do we ensure accountability? And that, of course, is our big issue about ensuring that contractors do not do what is inherently governmental. And what is inherently governmental is clearly the supervision of these contractors.
Thank you for that. And a final quick question to General Gambetesa. You mentioned the figure, I think it was $18 million to oversee $14 billion of expenditure. In your judgment, should there be, and this is really a question for all inspectors general here, but I'll direct it only to you. In your judgment, should there be a fixed percentage of the budget allocated for Inspector General oversight, and any increase in the budget likewise should be matched by a corresponding increase in Inspector General budgets to ensure that you have the resources that you need to provide due oversight over American taxpayer expenditures?
Yeah, I'm not certain there should be an actual percentage per se, but I think there should be oversight programmed into any of these programs. I mean, we're seeing it more and more now with the proposal on the stimulus package. If you've read some of that, the House version includes oversight for the inspectors general for each of these programs. I can't recite them specifically, but I know there's OIG oversight provisions in there, or funding for Office of Inspectors General in there. I agree that there should be funding. Our funding primarily has always come from supplementals. So when the agency over the 5 or 6 years received these billions of dollars, we basically were given some supplemental funding. And in fact, I don't believe, in fact, all of our funding, that whole $18 million has all been supplemental funding. Now, we've been working with OMB to have the funding put in our base, and in 10, it is finally going to be in there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clark. Commissioner Zackheim?
Yes, Mr. Gambitesta, I guess I'm a little confused. You talk on page 5 of your testimony about lessons that you learned from Afghanistan that you applied to Iraq, which is all well and good. How come it's taken you, or it's going to take you about 8 years to finally get 2 people into Kabul?
We are going to have people there this year.
But my question is, why has it taken 8 years to do it?
Well, we've been working actually quite effectively from Manila. And if you look at the way Iraq works, considering the benefits as far as leave, employees are there for 1 year. And in that 1 year, they're maybe on the ground 10 months out of the year. You lose a significant amount of continuity when you do that, and they're only 1 year assignments. So it appeared that the best way to do it was to maintain the oversight from Manila, and it's been working quite well. However, over the last year or so, we've looked into it and decided that we are going to put a couple of people there to maintain continuity as best we can. Of course, again, we're going to have these 1 year assignments, and someone's there really only 10 months rather than a year. So I can't tell you why it's taken 8 years, other than it was a decision that was made prior to my taking over the office, and I've been looking at it since I've been here for the last couple of years.
Okay.
And we finally decided to move forward.
You also mentioned that you had a real problem with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. Mm-hmm. And you say here that they relied on a letter of credit from AID. They transferred funds to and from an AID project systematically. And I'm quoting here, without USAID's knowledge or consent. When asked to explain the transfers, the organization refused to justify the use of the majority of these funds, which I'm sure makes American taxpayers really happy. And then you go on to say justice couldn't prosecute because all these characters have immunity. Mm-hmm. Are we still doing any business with this organization?
Well,
and if so, why?
Well, that was my question. The majority of the contracts, I sent a letter to the acting administrator last week on UNDP, and my estimate is that UNDP and UN Ops were given about $475 million in contracts over a 4 or 5 year period.
475 million?
475 million in various
for which they will
grants.
Presumably have immunity if they siphon it all off into Swiss banks?
Well,
is that accurate? They will be totally immune no matter what they do with the money?
My understanding is yes. Now, I brought this to the attention of the acting administrator, and now after our investigation, the majority of the grants that were given to UNDP were either terminated or some of them had already run out. And there is still one ongoing that I brought to the attention of the administrator, the acting administrator, and that I'm concerned about, and hopefully they will take some action on it. But as of late, the mission has, in fact, taken significant action, but yours was the same question as mine, and I brought that to their attention, and hopefully they'll work on this.
Well, I'm glad you're pursuing it, and I'd like to ask both you and Mr. Geisel a question that I'm much more familiar with the DOD IG. They used to come to me for money. Talk to me about the process, and I tended to give them what they asked for, so that's why I'm asking this. Talk to me about the process of asking for money. You've already said that this all comes out of SUPS. So presumably for the last 7 years, AID did not see fit to put it in its baseline budget. What about the State Department? Are you being adequately funded? Have you found that each year you come in with a certain request and it gets cut back? Where does it cut back? Why does it get cut back?
Until 2008, the state IG was basically flatlined. We went to the, I can't say because I was there, but I did come back rather shocked in 2008 to discover that we had essentially the same budget that we had when I left in 1995.
Could you talk to the magnitude of growth in terms of contracts overseen between the time you left and the time you came back?
I don't have it that far back, but as I testified...
Give me a swag.
Oh, swag?
Yeah.
300%.
Flatline growth and 300% contract growth. Go ahead, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
please.
That's right. Now, this year, or actually in the late 2008 and this year, we were the beneficiaries of a supplemental, which went entirely for support of our Middle East operations. We have no assurance that this amount will be carried forward into 2010, which is why I've hesitated to build up in the way of people in the Middle East for fear that we'll lose them again. But we understand from our congressional staff that they're inclined to include the same funding again. And we hope that they'll make it a regular part of our regular appropriation so that we can build more of a base in the Middle East. I can say that the department itself has gotten religion and that the department also supports our requests now.
Well, you say the department's gotten religious. Let me ask how religious. Mr. Gambitesa pointed out that this year it's going to be the funding for the IG will be in the baseline budget, correct? Has the State Department gotten enough religion to put it in the funding for this year's budget?
I don't know. This year's
the upcoming budget, just like AID.
The upcoming budget, my understanding is yes.
So it is now in the baseline budget.
It's been asked for.
Yeah, the budget request.
Yes.
And is it an amount that you consider sufficient to train and hire the kinds of people that are needed?
The good news is I can say absolutely yes. If we get what we've asked for, we will be able to do all the work that we feel needs to be done.
Do you feel the same way, Mr. Gambitesa?
Yes, and I'd like to clarify one point. The USAID really has never signed off or chopped off on our budget. We submit our budget to USAID and then directly to OMB. So if we've had any reductions, it's been really from OMB and the pass back. But USAID has not, in my experience, chopped off or had any reduction in our budget.
Funny you should mention OMB. So OMB's been cutting back on your requests?
They have in the past, yes.
Has that been the same with state?
I really, well, the answer is we don't know where it's been cut back because, as I say, we've been flatlined all these years.
Nothing to cut back.
But unfortunately, for whatever reason, our requests to OMB do go through the department.
Okay. And then, Mr. Gimbel, let me just ask you quickly, what's been your experience? Are you getting everything you need from the DoD comptroller and then through OMB?
I'd like to say that we could always use more, but we've actually been done very well. And let me just give you this. We've increased significantly in the past 2 years to kind of catch up with the increased contracting growth and what have you. Also, I'm very pleased to say that we have been working off what I think they're referring to as supplementals. We referred to them as wedges, and that is being baselined, and assuming that the budget goes forward, we have not been cut by the DoD comptroller and pretty well gotten what we need. And as I say, we put together a 5-year growth plan, went over and briefed that, and we've pretty much gotten what we've asked for.
And I've got a minute left, so a very quick question. How much do the three of you work together?
I think we do a lot of coordination together. As far as actual work on the ground, I don't think we do a lot. But we all serve on various commissions and various, well, we interact in the Southeast Asia Task Force, we interact with SEGAR, we interact with SEGAR, But as far as actual on-the-ground work, there's only been a few instances that I'm aware of where we've actually done audits together, primarily because obviously I can't audit a state program or a DoD program. We have with state, though, looked at a program holistically. For example, in Afghanistan, we had one situation on the alternative development programs where state was looking at the crop eradication program, and we were looking at the alternative development at the same time. So we've done things like that.
I would just point out that, frankly, there's enough work for all of us all of the time. I find the coordination very good. And as the aide IG pointed out, look, these are different agencies, and I think the most important thing is that we do, A, not interfere with each other's good work, and B, what we've seen very successfully is that we get help when we need it, as far as programs that do overlap.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Stuff, Commissioner Gustitis.
I want to follow up a little bit on the Blackwater issue, and that is that what's a little bit odd about Blackwater, and I guess I'm speaking to you, Mr. Gazelle, it's your contract, is that state didn't really act on Blackwater until Iraq decided to not license Blackwater any longer. And you had a report in December 2008, which was the status of the Secretary of State's panel on personal protective services in Iraq. It was your recommendations. And recommendation 5 was, when the FBI investigation into the September 16, 2007 incident, Nazir Square, is completed, the embassy should submit its recommendation as to whether the continued services of the contractor involved is consistent with the accomplishment of the overall United States mission in Iraq. And the State Department said it was going to await the outcome of that investigation, and you agreed with that decision to await the outcome of the FBI investigation. But didn't you and State have enough information at that point to make your own assessment, to use your words, as to whether keeping Blackwater was, quote, consistent with the accomplishment of the overall United States mission in Iraq?
As you know, the FBI report is not yet complete, but I take your point very seriously. The issue is not only one of, well, what we would like to do, but it also is to some extent what the department can do. Blackwater had certain assets that the department determined the other contractors did not have. Now,
what were those assets?
Well, aircraft were one of the big assets. No, as far as I know, I believe Blackwater had 24. I don't know if the the two other contractors had any. Did they? No. That's all that being said and done. We did, as you pointed out, advise the department that they better start planning for when the Iraqis said this is it with Blackwater, and without getting into diplomatic negotiations, I believe the department is planning for this eventuality, which is clearly not too far off.
But is it because Iraq refuses to license them, or is it because we think that Blackwater isn't helping us meet our mission, setting aside the licensing issue, that it isn't meeting the mission that we want in Iraq? Do you know what I mean? Is it just because we're being forced to because they're no longer licensed, or is it because of how Blackwater operates or what they're doing to our work?
I can't answer for the department, but what I can say is that since the horrible incident, which is not going to go away and which obviously greatly affected our relations with Iraq. In terms of the performance of their contract, Blackwater has, both from the department's point of view and even from our own subsequent audits and investigations, Blackwater has done a very good job of providing personal protection for our people.
Which is our perspective being that we're safe, not necessarily how the Iraqis feel about how we keep ourselves safe.
We pointed that out, and I take the point completely.
Okay, going forward in Afghanistan, we do have a contract. Our state has a major contract with Blackwater in Afghanistan. Do you think that should be reviewed in light of what we've seen in Iraq?
It is being, I don't know what the department itself is doing. I'm sure they are reviewing it, but I can tell you that we are reviewing it, and we have an upcoming review from OIG to examine their performance in Afghanistan.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Hey, Linda, would you give me my 2 minutes I had? I have a
Sure, go right
direct
ahead.
question on this. And
Go right ahead.
Thank you very much. And my question is, I was a little surprised. Take everything Linda said and Commissioner Gustitis, and I read in its media, but I'm sure you all read it too, last week that the State Department had some disclosure that they were polling their other two private security contractors to find out their capability to augment and support. I found that really surprising. Not that they do it, but they did it after they had their license revoked, because you had to know with the heat the country was coming down with all their threats right from September, October of '07 that it was coming. And my question is about the planning, and you talked about having diplomatic security management concerns like policies and processes and understaff and contract management and so on. It would seem to me that such a large contract with such a large critical mission that maybe a normal business or a normal government entity might begin that planning regardless, because it was highly likely that something adverse could occur. And yet now we read in the paper that, well, they've decided to go ahead and ask them. Well, that planning might take another 6 months or another year. You can't just, as you say, you can't just yank them out now. Do you have some observations on that?
I sure do. I have every reason to believe that diplomatic security was planning for a possible forced departure of Blackwater. I don't want to go into the details, A, because I don't know all of them, and B, because, as you know better than I do, I'm very scared in terms of contract negotiations, what may be going on. But as we pointed out, the state has got itself one heck of a job, and we'll just have to see.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda.
On the same note then, on private security contractors, Mr. Gamatisa, on January 27th this year, the Wall Street Journal reported that a contingent of Army Rangers operating in Afghanistan were recently attacked by Afghans wielding machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. Are you familiar? You look like you're not aware of this. Maybe Mr. Gazelle, I think this is a USAID situation, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's DODIG. Several of the attackers were identified posthumously as guards hired by an Afghan road construction firm to protect its laborers. So these were PSCs that were hired by the road construction firm. And the same article goes on to quote U.S. and Afghan officials as stating that some of these guards take orders from the Taliban and from drug gangs. It's a pretty extensive article, and I'm going to give you a copy of it. This is the version I have. My question, I'm not going to just direct it to you since you haven't read the article or you're not aware of it. Is anybody at the table aware of this concern of hiring private security guards in Afghanistan that turn to be working with the Taliban and fighting our own people?
I've just been assured that from our point of view, which is of course quite different than the other two IGs because most of our work is in Kabul itself, the private security work. We have no knowledge whatsoever of this problem.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, Mr. Kimball?
We have no knowledge of this particular incident. In fact, I don't believe I've seen the article. I'm very, very interested in it, but we have no dealings with it. In fact, we don't deal much with the private security companies, DODIG.
Okay. Can I give this article to you all and you take a look at it and get back to us as to your reaction to it and whether you think further? I mean, to me, it sounds like investigation is definitely warranted. You'll see it's a very thorough article. And the question is, who should be doing that? Maybe it's Cigar. I don't know. Yes?
Does it name the security company that hired these people?
I don't know. I don't think it does, actually. Okay. I'll get that back to you. Mr. Geisel, you talked about the question of inherently governmental and basically said that one thing we shouldn't do is we shouldn't have contractors overseeing contractors. I mean, that we should do our own contract management. And I couldn't agree with you more. But what we have right now in Iraq and Afghanistan contracting is we've got, with LogCap, we have Serco is the contractor that's managing the LogCap contract. That's in that. We have Aegis is the big contractor that's overseeing the private security contractors in Iraq. And we have, under reconstruction with the PMO, we had the PMO jobbing out contractor management. I'm going to ask all three of you, do you all agree that, or do you think, I should say, that those kinds of contracts are inappropriate because essentially they are hiring contractors to manage contractors? Yeah, we'll start with Mr. Gimbel.
We believe that contract oversight is inherently governmental, and it should be contractors overseeing contractors should be avoided if at all possible.
I would concur. A good example is the Community Stabilization Program in Iraq that I mentioned earlier. Because of USAID's inability to actually go out and review the progress of the contractor, they've actually hired, they have another contract, or maybe a grant, to actually oversee the performance of the contractor actually performing the original duty. So now you have, it really gets convoluted. So you have a contractor to pay a contractor to oversee and report on the performance of another contractor because employees, U.S. employees, can't really get out to actually see if it's being done properly.
None of the contractors you mentioned are involved with Department of State contracts, but I voiced a concern, and we found examples that were one in particular, which I'll mention to you, which was egregious, and we were pleased to see that the department didn't even wait for our written report. They agreed to change their procedures. They were going to have a contractor contracted to investigate incidents similar to Blackwater.
As the USIS contract, is that right?
And we, exactly, and we objected, and I don't think we waited a week.
Oh, I'm great. I'm happy to know that. So that was your objection, though, that brought that to the attention of State, saying that that was a misguided decision on their part.
Well, hopefully great minds were thinking alike, but in any event, we certainly did object.
Okay. I have just one quick housekeeping item, and that is that it's a little unfair, Mr. Gazelle, but we've sent you a letter back in November asking for all your reports, investigative records, et cetera, with respect to private security contractors, and we've made a couple follow-up phone calls. We haven't gotten the information, so I'm going to say this today so that I'm sure that you can address it this week. And I'll give you the letter.
We have only issued 2 reports, our Assistant IG for the Middle East says, and we sent them both.
Right. I think we're asking for the investigative summaries as well. So if you could talk to our staff after the hearing, I'd really appreciate it, and if we could resolve that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Henke?
One of the issues that we need to look at as a commission is the extent of our reliance on contractors and contracted support, both in a wartime scenario and then a post-conflict scenario immediately after, whether it's stability or reconstruction, humanitarian relief. I'd like to get from each of you in series your thoughts on that, and if you'd start with the extent to which your audit work has looked at the question of our reliance, perhaps over-reliance on contracted support in contingency operations. So first of all, has your work looked at that? And then secondly, your judgment as to the extent of reliance. Mr. Gimbel.
We are looking at that. We think that is a very important issue. I think we have a number of projects underway, and certainly we would like to work with the Commission as we move down the path on that.
Give us a sense of what the work is going to involve and how you're thinking about the problem.
Well, I think we need to identify how many contractors that will get into the subcontracting category. I can't give you an example right off the top of my head, but we do have some, and I'll get back with you on that for the record.
Okay.
But we do believe that is an extremely important issue.
When would that work be available?
We can provide detail at
Okay.
subsequent.
If you're in the staffing process for the review, how are you thinking about measuring the amount and extent of reliance? And if you have a staff member here who can answer, that'd be great. Sure.
When you take a look at which as a symptom causes the issue related also to the inherently governmental function.
Right.
You just don't have enough contractor government oversight. So this has been, multiple issues all hitting right about now, in which you have this going on for since we last testified in 1998 on this matter. So it's not just solving Southwest Asia.
Right.
It is solving the systemic issues that we have in contracting in general, and that it's been going on. And if you look at our testimony for the record, Mr. Gimbel's testimony for the record, it's been going on since the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
And the Truman Commission also cited similar issues. It has not changed much.
Okay. Mr. Camatisa.
We have not actually looked at an audit of reliance on contractors, but we feel that it's always best to have U.S. direct hire employees to oversee or to manage contracts.
But to manage the contract.
Well, to manage. You're
Right.
talking. Your question has to do with: are we reviewing
the extent of reliance and our risk associated with that reliance on contracted functions?
Right. No, we have not done that. Obviously, using direct hires to run programs rather
Certainly.
than contractors is certainly preferable. But for USAID, over the years, the agency's ranks have dwindled so much over the years that they've relied more and more on contractors, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Sir?
At State, we indicated in the testimony that where we were most concerned, State, until relatively recently, did not have a tremendous reliance on contractors, except in some of the drug interdiction efforts. But in Iraq and now in Afghanistan, of course, our biggest concern was whether the management of contractors was adequate in the area of security. And we have addressed our concerns.
Taking as a given that it would be a contracted function as it was then. Is that right?
Well, we don't have the resources. The department has considered whether, I think in response to concerns from Congress, whether it would be appropriate to bring on security officers for, let's say, limited appointments for these needs. But I think to date, the department has felt that it would be, well, it would take too much time and the management challenges would be even greater if they took government-appointed security officers as opposed to contractors. This is something that the department in its entire history never faced until Iraq.
Okay. Thank you. I have a follow-up in my second round. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Henke. Commissioner Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gimbel, on January 29th, DODIG took what I think is a major and new step, which has not yet been reported, in a long-standing controversy over whether to hold back payments from certain Halliburton KBR bills. Excuse me for talking about this like I was back in the University of Baltimore Law School. I'll try to move along quickly. Back in 2004, DCA auditors recommended invoking the regulation that would withhold 15% of payments on undefinitized contracts. At the time, there was also about $1.8 billion in particular questioned costs. A fresh review was asked of the fact that the Army had not withheld, and you issued a decision. I know this review is at the very beginning. Without asking you to go beyond any limits as to something at this very beginning, can you say that you're going to hold a review?
Yes, we've announced the review and then requested, as you well know, a number of records and documents. And I think the underlying issue here is it's it's a disputed set of question costs, and the question would be is what is the process to mediate come to a resolution. I can give you an example. We in the DODIG, as an example, in the mid-'80s did not have a resolution process or mediation process. We would make recommendations and they had no teeth in them. Now, I don't know, this in some ways may be parallel to that, but in the mid-'80s we implemented through DOD instruction or direction or directives an ability. We have a formal mediation process. If we make a recommendation and have a dispute, there's a process you go through to mediate it up to the Deputy Secretary would make the decision, final decision based on the facts at hand. Most often that is mediated at a much lower level, but this would appear to be a disagreement between the Defense Contract Audit Agency and a contracting officer. So that may be the long-term look at this, but to answer your question, we are looking at this. We're going to look at it very aggressively.
Okay. I just, I'm not going to ask you, of course, at this early stage, the scale or scope of review. I'm just trying to understand whether it's one of these narrow things or broader things. There are narrow things about a particular subcategory of cost, the meals, the oil purchases and so forth. And there are other things that go to a much broader scale, the 15% of all the undefinitized costs or the $1.8 billion. Is this one of these narrow scale reviews or is this a broader review?
This will be the review that we've announced will address this specific issue, but we also, I think, will have a broader based view is that if we determine this to be an issue of lack of a process, we'll probably be making recommendations, in this case to the comptroller, to be looking at developing a process that would mediate some of these question costs, particularly in the most significant, cases.
Which, to my mind, I'm not quoting you, to my mind involves billions of dollars in payments. That's what this contract involves. Back in 2004, when DCAA fought for the 15% withholding, it was a rather lonely fight by the auditors who were doing their job at the time against great odds. Critics said at the time that Halliburton was getting special treatment. I'm in no way asking you to prejudge what your outcome is going to be. I'm just going to say that it looks like some vindication for DCAA that they even waged the fight this long. Would you care to comment that whether the auditors will at least have an opportunity in the review to express their point of view?
I think with any of our reviews, we'll have both sides of the story to get a balanced final conclusion.
I thank you, Mr. Gimbel. This was very illuminating. You have you have an ongoing investigation with DFAS involving a lot of payment vouchers that are housed, I think, in Rome, New York, for Army purchases in Iraq that were not properly documented. I spoke with your able deputy, Mary Ugone, who has been giving valuable leadership for years on this long effort. You did a report and hearing testimony. You've been doing this in stages. It's a big project. Last May. When might the next 2 stages of this be done?
Well, I'm sure you're probably aware that we were in the process of scanning in a number of documents. And just to put it in perspective, about 8,000 boxes of documents. Okay, we were scanning those in to get them in a searchable database. Unfortunately, we have identified, or the folks doing this have identified, that there was some classified information caught up in the middle of it. We're in the process of, I understand that DFAS has something like 45 employees that are working through this issue. We're not sure what the ramifications in terms of the timeline of that will be, but we're still aggressively working that, and we think there's going to be some big dividends paid off for the review.
Okay. You'll understand that with work on this scale that you're doing, the Commission needs to be up to speed. I can't wait until the final public release of reports. You do exit interviews or briefings on discussion drafts. In this instance, I would assume you do them with the DFAS and the Army Controller. Would you have a problem with offering us non-publicly a briefing at the discussion draft stage on this Herculean investigation, I would say?
I think the first thing, we issued the audit report on this back in last May. That is a formal report, and we'd be more than happy to brief that to you. So far as the ongoing work, a lot of that is not really, it's audit assist work in support of investigative work. And typically on investigative work, we do not brief that until we come to some conclusion. But we would be willing to work with the things that we can brief you on. We certainly would do that.
Okay. If I can ask about, just last week, a major step forward was reported publicly in the investigation of the electrocutions of soldiers in Iraqi housing. This was a letter that DCIS wrote to the mother of one of the deceased, a public letter, that the electrocution had been changed in terms of how it was classified from merely accidental to negligent homicide. Can you explain a little as to what this signified? Is this a big deal?
Actually, that was not the DCIS. That was the Army CID that wrote that letter. And so I'm really not in a position to comment on it.
Okay. Okay. Typo in the newspaper. Okay. You have started an investigation that's of great interest to us on the transition planning from Log Cap 3, which was the monopoly contract for KBR, to LOGCAP 4, which isn't a monopoly contract for future task orders. And some have said that the transition has not been helped by KBR, particularly in things like accounting for property in its hands that's U.S. property, U.S. government property. Will your inquiry be looking at whether the contractor isn't fully accounting for GFE property?
Yeah, we're at the closeout. We're at the end of field work on that, and we will be addressing significant issues. The draft we are planning on issuing in March, and we'll probably give about 60 days to finish it up in final, maybe a little quicker than that. But we will address a number of issues that deal with the transition, the orderly transition, and the challenges of the transition as it moves from LOGCAP 3 to LOGCAP 4.
My previous question, I'll repeat, or request I'll repeat. Would you agree for DODIG to brief us at the draft, the discussion draft stage, on a non-public basis and in ways that protect the integrity of your work?
We will. I'm not sure how much detail we can give you, but we will give you a status brief, and I think we can work with something in that line. But really, the issue we have in briefing draft reports before we get outside the department, if we have significant disagreements or issues, we like to have those vetted before we go outside the department. And I'm not in position right now to know if we have those kind of issues on this particular report or not.
And I'm not in a position to discuss this further. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. We're at the second round stage, and Inspector General Gimbel, when we were in Afghanistan, we got a really good briefing from the United States Army Corps of Engineers, that does a lot of acquisition and programs there. And it was, I don't want to get carried away about the Corps, though, because we didn't get a good briefing in Iraq. So 1 out of 2 is pretty good. But the Afghan one was real good. And but one of the things we asked as we were wrapping up is, and it's one of these questions you ask sometimes, where we say, and there were about 10 of us sitting around the table, of everything you do, what has the greatest risk for fraud? And 3 of them immediately, right out their mouth, came SERP. The Commander's Emergency Relief Program. I mean, it was boom, and it was like, okay, I guess SERP is on their mind. And you have some very recent and interesting work where, for example, you stated that you tested 16 pay agents and 15 of them didn't have adequate security controls. You reported it, they agreed to take a look at it and all that. 2 of them actually didn't get out of the 16, they handed out the wrong amount of cash. They didn't know how to distribute cash. And to put it in quantum, one of the things that they have shared is that the SERP projection now for annual funding is about $700 million a year at about $500,000 ceiling that someone has latitude over. That's a lot of latitude spread all over the country without a lot of documentation. Are you as concerned as I am?
Mr. Chairman, I am. But let me put a little context on it if I could. I think that report you're referring to is 2007.
Okay.
And we do have some plans to look at additional SERP operations. We think that's a very important program, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also Pakistan. And we think that, but because of the very nature of it, it has challenges with the control of how you get the proper approval. How do you know what you're asking for? How do you know that you're getting what you pay for, and how's it documented, and so forth? So we think it's a very challenging area, but we think it's a very important tool for the commanders.
I think along the lines of Commissioner Tiefer, we will obviously be working with you because we're going to be drilling down into that ourselves because it probably is a very important program. But in terms of controls, it just, you're an auditor, I'm an auditor, the need for controls is probably greatly enhanced, if that's an understatement. I'd like to also talk to you a little bit about property. We know that in the dialogue that Iraq is going to draw back, downsize. I mean, that's there is a lot of government furnished equipment in a very extensive number of warehouses and facilities. There have been reports by different organizations of government property kind of laying out in the open where it shouldn't be. where government property is in warehouses or in storage facilities, and it's really not being maintained or accounted for, controlled, inventoried, like maybe it ought to be. And when we addressed, or when we were briefed by the Defense Contract Management Agency, they were very candid, and they said this is a high-risk area, and they were ramping their staff way up in order to do property audits in light of the planned downsizing in Iraq, which implication is everybody knows that there's a really significant dollar-wise problem. And that doesn't count the policy issue. You know, what do? Do you refurbish and ship somewhere else in some other theater? Do you destroy it in place? Do you give it to the home team? You know, how do you handle it? Can you talk a little bit about what your plans are, and as you go forward in this area, realizing it's pretty close to #1 on some organizations' risk area?
We do have a number of projects planned to look at the property accountability, not only in, you know, we're looking at night vision or sensitive items, we're looking at the weapons and munitions, but also equally importantly is the equipment itself. And actually this has the concern, I think, of the Central Command. We were down in December talking to General Petraeus, and he had indicated that that was one of his areas of concern. So we're putting together a number of projects to address those very issues, because you're correct, if we're so fortunate as to pull down in the forces in Iraq, somebody needs to know where the equipment is, what kind of condition it is, and where you can have a good basis to make a decision whether to bring it home or you know, do some other disposition with it.
Right, there have been historical stories, without going into history, about where we pull out of some theaters and leave a lot of functional equipment hanging around for the other team, and it would be too bad if we did something like that. We'll move on to Commissioner Irvin, but before we do that, I want to tell all three of you thank you for me. Commissioner Irvin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my own thanks as well. Each of you in your own way has done tremendously important work in this regard, and we're going to be building on it during the course of our own work. I guess a first question from me to you, General Geisel. One of the more interesting quotations in the Hard Lessons report that SIGA released today is this one: the lack of unity of command in Iraq meant that unity of effort was seldom achieved. Too often programs were designed to meet agency goals rather than overall U.S. national interests. In that connection, using that quotation as a baseline, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Chief of Mission Authority. The ambassador in a country is supposed to be not just the representative of the State Department of that country, but really is the President's representative to that country, and as such should have authority to coordinate the overall work of each agency represented in the embassy to ensure that the overall interests of the United States are achieved. Obviously, that has broken down in Iraq and appears to be breaking down in Afghanistan. What, in your judgment, can and should be done to strengthen Chief of Mission Authority so that unity of purpose is achieved?
Of course, we're not talking about military commands, which have always been exempt from Chief of Mission Authorities, although one must say that that was not the problem in Iraq, certainly in the latter days in Iraq. I think what has to be done is this has to come from the White House. It can't come from anywhere else. It's the National Security Council. It's the White House telling agencies that they will respect Chief of Mission Authority. It's also, of course, a matter of chiefs of mission exercising that authority. It's also a matter of money, because money talks. And so often, state has the ideas, but it's other agencies that have the bucks.
Well said. Now, in that regard, a follow-up question for you, General Gimbel. Given that DOD has the bucks and the manpower and the material and the command presence, for want of a better term, DOD tends to be the default agency when complex missions arise, not just in the military context, but also in the context of Katrina. That being so, you know, I know that, to his great credit, Secretary Gates has made this issue of interagency cooperation and a concern about contract oversight and contract management. That is a major issue for him. What is the extent of your relationship with the Secretary? To what extent have you built upon that to ensure that going forward, the lessons learned in Iraq are not repeated in Afghanistan in future contingent operations, for that matter?
The question is, the relationship with the DoD IG and the Secretary's office is very good, very positive. However, the move forward into those policy issues, frankly, from an IG standpoint, we look and do the oversight of whatever the decisions were made, and so that, I guess I'm trying to say this maybe just a little above my pay grade.
Well, what I'm talking about really, though, is ensuring that the Secretary's support for your work is communicated down from the Secretary's office throughout the whole of DoD. Is that happening to the best of your knowledge?
Very well.
You're satisfied with that?
We're very, very satisfied with the support we get out of the Secretary.
And then a final question for each of you. Given that we're likely to engage in contingent operations for the foreseeable future, and given that each of you has other work to do outside of looking at your respective agencies' performance with regard to these operations, is there some support among you for the notion of there being a discrete Inspector General simply for contingent operations?
You know, there's been two such, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan and Iraq. I think you'll find everyone at this table, and I can't speak for my counterparts, but we believe that we can support. We believe there's enough oversight work that we can all be engaged, and we all need to be supportive, and I believe that we make the case that over the past several years we have been very supportive of each other.
I agree with Mr. Gimbel. But I think one thing that Seeger, and I listened to some of Mr. Bowen's testimony this morning, and I've read his reports, his quarterly reports. I think what he has provided over the years is an overview across all agencies, which I'm not sure any one of us could actually provide. As far as the actual oversight of the programs, I think we individually are probably better equipped to oversee the programs of our own individual agencies. However, if you're looking for the overview of the historical aspects and some of the other areas that Mr. Bowen can provide, I think there is some benefit in that area.
Thank you, Commissioner Irvin.
Time is running. Oh, sorry.
No,
Time is running out, and I can only agree with my colleagues.
Thank you.
My apologies to the State Department and to yourself. Thank you, Clark. Commissioner Zackheim.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask you first, Mr. Gimbel, you talked actually in response to my colleague Charles Tiefer's questions about DCAA's, I think Charles called it a lonely fight in 2004. My colleague to the right was one of the fighters, and I was trying to provide him protection. Didn't succeed as much as I wanted to. But now you're looking into some of these disputes, and you talked about mediation. Do you think we should legislate that mediation? In other words, should that be legislated, that when you have DCAA challenging something like that and there's clearly a dispute within the department, that there be legislated mediation, because we're talking about things that started 5 years ago and we're finally getting around to them?
I actually believe it can be done through DoD directive, but if that was done through DoD directive and that was not successful, then probably it would take legislation.
Okay. Thank you. Let me ask you this, all three of you. You've all agreed that there really ought to be that contractors should not oversee other contractors. Would you support legislation on that one? We'll start with the State Department.
Essentially, yes. It might be faster and more flexible if there was an executive order, but we need something that we're desperately looking for definitions that work in the 21st century. I can't speak for my colleagues, but I'd be surprised if they didn't feel the same way. It is such an important problem, and yet it gets short shrift so often.
Well, I would agree. Whether the mechanism is legislation or presidential directive or directive from the administration, which as Mr. Geisel said, would probably be faster and easier to do than legislation. But I agree that something should be done in that area. And may I qualify something I said to you earlier? on the United Nations Development Program. Our investigation is centered on one aspect of, we received an allegation in one aspect of that program. The agency looked at the entire program and made modifications to the whole program, and they are no longer issuing new agreements to UNDP. My letter to the acting administrator was with the ongoing programs, whether they should be continued or stopped.
Well, again, I would say...
I want to clarify that they did take action.
That's perfectly clear, and that's helpful, but I reiterate my concern that deal with anybody that's got total immunity is kind of scary, at
We
least
have the
to
same
me.
concern.
Let me, Mr. Gimbel, you were going to respond to the question about legislation, contractors overseeing contractors.
Actually, I think we already have that authority in Section 324 of the 2008 Authorization Act, and it gives some guidance on how you can make those choices, and probably that might be something that would be very beneficial to the state and the USAID.
Okay, so you would generalize it. While I've got you, let me ask you another legislative-related question. You state that there's a need for the JCCIA to really have independent cost estimates for all contract solicitations. Is that something that you think DoD directives can take care of? Is that something that, again, should be legislated? Is that something that you would think ought to be government-wide, in your personal and professional opinion?
Well, let me address first I am a big believer that we can handle most things through DoD directive. Short of that, to me, getting legislation is basically one of the last resorts for a departmental issue. And so I believe that we could do that through directive.
Okay. On the JCCIA, again, do you think there ought to be a separate, essentially a splitting up of the I and the A, that you should really be managing contracts in Afghanistan, for Afghanistan, in Afghanistan? Are you satisfied with the current setup?
I think as Afghanistan grows, it would be something that should be thought about, because I think it probably is big enough to have its own separate, the JCCIA, just A, separating it from the I.
And then one final question to all of you. Clearly, we all recognize that the acquisition corps, government-wide, is not where we'd like it to be. Right now, are deployments of contracting officers voluntary, or do they have to go? And secondly, how are they vetted in terms of the experience they may have? Let me start with Mr. Geisel, and I'll thank you all in advance for your answers and your help.
So far, we have had sufficient volunteers that we have not had to deploy anyone to either Iraq or Afghanistan. My concern is not deploying the contractors, not the contracting officers, the contracting officer representatives. My concern is that we get good people who know what they're doing and who don't have so many other duties, additional duties, I believe is what the military wisely calls them, that they can't do a proper job. We've always had the people in OIG and throughout the department, but are they the right people? Do they have the right training, and do they have the time to do a good job? I'm not sure at all. I don't think they are.
Thank you.
My understanding is that USAID has relied on Foreign Service officer volunteers so far in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in other areas where they're conflict areas. But as far as training goes, as I mentioned in my statement earlier, they have significant problems in numbers of cognizant technical officers or COTARs and contracting officers, and it's an issue with lack of staffing in the agency in general, which they have been working on. They've gotten the funding to hire about 300 more people, 300 more individuals, Foreign Service officers in 08, and they're trying to double the size of the direct hire Foreign Service officers in USAID in the next 2 or 3 years.
Thank you, Commissioner. Oh, we got one more. I can't count anymore.
Actually, we have a split. It's my understanding our civilian contracting officers the military obviously are assigned, and we've noted in a number of our audits and evaluations that there is a challenge of having a sufficient cadre of trained contracting officers and contracting officer technical representatives.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Zackheim. I guess it's obvious now that after 3 o'clock, it's pretty difficult to count to 3, so I'm on a roll. Commissioner Gustitis?
For the record, the name of the road building company that was referred to in that Wall Street Journal article is the Rahim Road Building Construction Company, and I think they hired the private security contractors. That way. I want to ask each of you, how important do you think the requirements stage of contracting is? Because I've been focusing on this a lot in terms of our work, the importance of making the requirements in a contract clear and unequivocal, really. Mr. Gimbel?
We believe that the requirements determination, the development of a contract is probably the most critical of all the things you do, because if you don't have that laid out initially, you can never be sure that you're getting what you need and it meets the requirements of the mission.
I would agree. It's very important for the requirements to be laid out very clearly. I mean, we in some of our audits have found where they haven't been, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's been problems because of that. And again, I take this back to lack of staff and lack of training of that staff, and it's through all of our reports. If you have the opportunity to read through some of them, you see that same thread through a lot of them, that lack of training, lack of personnel, lack of trained personnel.
Of course, I agree with my colleagues. In a previous incarnation, I was the boss of logistics management, which had our acquisitions underneath it. I think we do a pretty good job when it's at the Washington level of writing good contracts. My worry is the same as my colleagues, is when it gets out in the field where people are not adequately trained.
Which is a big chunk of the contingency contracting situation.
Exactly.
Okay. And then I'm going to ask you, if you could wave a magic wand and do one thing to change your agency to improve contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan, what would you do? Yes.
Oh, if I could wave my magic wand, I would have, for states, since we're relatively small, if I could have 100 superbly trained and qualified contracting officers and contracting officers representatives, my problems would be over.
You need 100, did you say?
Yeah, 100 would be great. Probably more than we need, but, you know, I've got a magic wand.
That's right.
I'll go
It's
for
magic, so you can go for it.
As I said earlier, I think USAID is on track to do just that and staff up, and I guess the magic wand would be that in the future that the Congress and obviously OMB would give them the resources they need to staff up. The agency is, I mean, I don't have their charts. I don't really, I'm not shilling for the agency here, but I believe that they do have a significant problem in that area.
I think that'd be a good solution. I'm just not sure 100 would be enough for DOD.
So it's all personnel. It's qualified contracting officers. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner Gustitis. Commissioner Tiefer, you are now officially the cleanup hitter. Oh, Commissioner Henke, well, you're not the cleanup hitter. Please, sir.
It's after 3, I understand.
All right.
Yeah. I want to pick up on a...
Left-handed, excuse me.
I want to pick up on a thought that you used, Mr. Geisel, and that is we need definitions that are useful in the 21st century. That, I think, is very insightful. And I want to get from each of you your professional views on is the term inherently governmental both clearly defined, one, and two, well understood? Yeah, sir.
I think at the qualified agency personnel level, it's very well understood. Is it clearly defined? No. I think different agencies actually have various legislation that defines inherently governmental differently, giving exceptions for certain areas. I repeat, I'd like nothing better than to have some definitions, broad enough that they can be worked with, but narrow enough that they can be enforced.
Well, I'm a little slow, but I will tell you, I don't think that they're very well defined, and if they are, they're not very well understood by the across the board. I mean, I think it's a real challenge, and if we could come up with some broad definitions that would work and it could be understood, I think that would be a huge step forward.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Gimbel. I don't think it is defined very well, and having been in government a long time, I'm not sure it is even well understood what inherently governmental means. I mean, it means something different to every agency, I think, depending on what their mission is and what their role is.
Secondly, what about this idea of having a contingency FAR? I know there's a chapter in the FAR that speaks of contingency operations, but each agency tends to apply it differently in their own, in the DFAR or the various agency regulations. What about having one authoritative, clear, multi-agency document that says this is how we're going to proceed in a contingency environment when it relates to interagency operations? Useful?
I certainly think it's something that should be explored to see if it can be, because the key to it would be is it has to be universally usable by across the spectrum. And once you get different requirements for the different types of agencies, that may cause some problem in definition down the road. But I think it's something worth exploring.
Yeah, I think it's worth exploring, but how do you do a FAR where, you know, it may apply to Afghanistan and Iraq, but maybe in a different part of the world you have a different sort of conflict or contingency, the term you're using. Mm-hmm. You're using contingency in a conflict area rather than in, is that how you're using contingency? Broadly
defined humanitarian, stability ops, conflict environment.
Yeah,
whatever contingency you would mean.
I think that I think it makes sense if you can make it broad enough so that it would cover any type of contingency.
Okay.
I'd say, to bring out the magic wand again, sure. It would be great if it doesn't tie our hands in ways that would hurt our ability to get the job done. What we're really looking for, above all else, is what we were talking about before, is definitions, and then the ability to carry out a contingency FAR would be great if it's broad enough to cover contingencies, which I know I'm sitting next to a lawyer is not easy.
Right. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, I think. Mr. Gimbel, as your testimony discusses the mandatory disclosure rule, which I think is a great step forward, about contractors having to provide where they have credible evidence of violations. As we've been briefed, and the Chairman has given good leadership on this, again and again we run into the problem of local subcontractors in Iraq. It's a different culture. Kickbacks, bid rigging are not seen there the way they're seen here. And there's our American prime contractors have a see no evil sort of policy. Do you think we're going to have valuable experience coming out of Iraq that supports the need for this rule?
Actually, the rule was put in place to be much, much broader than Iraq and Afghanistan, and it has to do with a lot of the major contractors here in the United States. You know, for years and years, and probably about 20 years, the DoD-IG has had a voluntary disclosure program that is very similar to this, and now that that's been enacted in the FAR, it makes it a mandatory disclosure on the part of the contractors. Now, quite honestly, we don't know what the impact of that's going to be. It was we thought we had a pretty successful voluntary program. We're hoping this will even be better yet, and we're beginning to see. I saw a referral come in for self-reporting the other day that which basically says, we don't believe we violated anything, but out of a great abundance of caution, we're going to report this. Well, if we get those kind of reportings, I think it'll help. We'll get a real good feel. We think it'll show within the next year to determine that, but we think it's a good program.
I hope going forward we'll be able to sort of learn with you how it works in our bailiwicks. To add to the discussion we had earlier about access at a stage earlier than the final publication, our staff have pointed out to us it's invaluable if at a discussion draft stage or whatever there can be staff access to DODIG staff. And I want to clarify here, our interest is in looking at the records in the basement of the house, and whether there's still family bickering going on the second floor doesn't interest us, and we can give assurances in that regard. If I had to read this starting last Friday, this hearing would have been not so good this morning. You need more time to prepare, or you're dealing with an old report by the time you are prepared. And now I'm not just speaking about one or two projects, but sort of your important wartime contracting. Can we make an effort to have that kind of access?
Absolutely. We'll make every effort possible to keep you well informed of the issues.
I thank you. Now I'll make it even harder for you to be this gracious to me. You're part of the KBR task force in Rock Island and Houston. That's where the fraud referrals go. I know I'm not asking about their open investigations, but when we were briefed by DCAA, and we said, well, what about when they close one of those? Then can you tell us about the closed ones? And the record will show that I'm shrugging my shoulders to say, is there some way that the task force could brief us about closed KBR task force investigations, even some fraction of those, so that it isn't... I'll stop. That's my question.
I think the answer to this is yes, we can.
And lastly, since there's been a good deal of discussion of the CFAR, I want to ask about some of the things that might be in it, and in particular, looking at the opposite side. Most times it seems that the discussion is how to waive rules, relax rules, make it easier. Are there things that would make your tasks easier? Do you think, and you can supply those for the record if you want a little time to think about it, but are there ways that because the early environment in the Iraq has been described right after the invasion as a, quote, Wild West, in which the efforts of you people to go in were kind of hopeless. Okay, that's a request for being supplied for the record. But in general, is the need for simplification or actually opening up a lot of exemptions in a CFAR? Which do we need? Just sort of clarification and simplification, or waivers, exemptions, and other loosening? I'll direct that to whichever of you wishes to answer that.
I think they've eliminated it themselves, and I'll have to be the one to be on the hook here. I think it's one of those things that we said earlier that you really need to look at. It's kind of like what definitions need to be looked at. I don't think any of us in a position to say that waive this particular clause or that particular clause at this point. I think it has to be something that's looked at and saying, okay, what are the common issues that come across contingency contracting, and how would they be, best applied? And it would be, I would broaden the field out to not only the wartime efforts, but the issues like Katrina. We saw a lot of similarities and challenges in that kind of contracting basis, where you have a lot of money going in with a large pressure to spend that money to get goods and services on the street. And when you get those things, all those elements together, we think that you could look at some of the common issues across the board and make a wise decision as to whether there needs to be any adjustment other than just a waiver, on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. This wraps up this panel. this wraps up this hearing. I want to turn to the audience and tell you all thanks. This has actually been a pretty good hearing. Some of those that I've sat in on the other side, I watch people coming and going and coming and going, and y'all have been a great audience. So thank you, and you've been a great panel, and you've been a pretty swell bunch of commissioners.